Welcome everyone to our ongoing series of classes in the S'dei Chemed encyclopedia, the halakhic encyclopedia, Jewish law. We are in the standard set, volume Ches, which would be 8. Klolim Mareches HaGimel, under the topic, the entry of Goy, and we are currently up to, which is Siman Vav, section 6, and we are in subsection Chai, 18. And this is class number 21 in the series of the S'dei Chemed. We are discussing, the S'dei Chemed that is bringing up various different laws that apply to the Jew in Jewish law as far as various different obligations or prohibitions. And then the question is, do they, and if they do, how do they, in what way, in what manner, do they apply to the Ben Noyach, to the non-Jew? Some of them, as we've mentioned, he simply makes references to various different other rabbis, his contemporaries, and sometimes he actually makes reference to other places in his own writings in a different section in this encyclopedia. And we're up to, as we mentioned, the 18th one, and that's going to be another topic now. And he's going to make reference to something which he spoke about earlier that we did do in a previous class. Today's section is going to be discussing a concept in the section, primarily in the section of Yeredeya in the Code of Jewish Law, in the dietary laws, the area of kashrus. And the topic is a very well-known topic for those that study the laws in detail, the dietary laws. And that is called ta'am ki'ikar, which basically means that the taste that something gives is considered like the item itself. So, for instance, if a Jew is forbidden to eat a certain type of food, let's say non-kosher meat, and he's not actually eating the meat, but something absorbed a taste of that meat. So that would be considered like that meat, and it would be forbidden. So we're going to discuss now, does that apply to the non-Jew? Because we all know that one of the 7 Noachide commandments is the prohibition against eating Aver min hachai, which means a limb or a part of a living creature, of an animal, that was removed, it was separated from the animal prior to the animal being totally, completely dead. Before the animal was dead, some part of the animal was removed. That is forbidden for a non-Jew to eat. So then the question becomes, does tam ki'ikar apply or not? If it applies, that means that if something was, let's say, forbidden meat was cooked in a pot, and the pot absorbed the taste, so now that pot becomes non-kosher for the non-Jew to use when he's making regular meats that he is allowed to eat. And if it doesn't apply, then there's no such thing as being concerned with what the walls of the pot have absorbed through the heat. Let's see it inside. So we're on page 3224, the right-hand column, second paragraph, where you have the number, or in letters, Chai, 18, and the first word is Ta'am, Tes, Ayin, final mem. Ta'am ki'ikar, im nesar livnei noyach. This concept of ta'am, of taste, ki'ikar being like the primary, the source itself, is that forbidden for non-Jews, for bnei noyach? Ayin la'goyin chasam soifer cheluk yeredei soif siman yutes. So he sends us to take a look in the responsa of the genius known as the Chasam Sofer. That's the name of the book that he wrote, and telling us exactly where it's to be found there. And he says, and I brought that down, I quoted the Chasam Sofer earlier in this section, towards the beginning. And also another authority, the genius who wrote the book called Muloi Haroim, he writes as follows: Detalia beplukta da Rambam v'Tosfos bedin shiurin inemru livnei noyach. Whether or not ta'am ki'ikar applies to the non-Jew is, according to the sources, the Chasam Sofer and the Muloi Haroim, is dependent on a different dispute that we have by the early codifiers between Maimonides, the Rambam, and the commentary on the Talmud, known as the Tosfos, whether shiurin, measurements, were given to the non-Jews. And we discussed this at great length previously in an earlier class where that was the topic. And just to recap and remind you, in Jewish law, for the Jew, measurements, amounts, play a tremendously important role. I mean, it really gets extremely detailed in so many commandments and so many rituals and so many mitzvahs. There's the minimum requirement. Sometimes there's the maximum. In just so many areas of Jewish observance. For example, when it comes to prohibited foods that a Jew is not allowed to consume. So if he consumes less than a certain amount, so then he's not punished by the court, by the Beis Din. So the question that we had back then was, does that same rule apply to Bnei Noyach or not? And it was a very lengthy discussion, back and forth. It's an argument between the Rambam and the Tosfos, whether shiurim, measurements, amounts, are only given for the Jewish people. And therefore, for a Ben Noyach, the slightest amount is forbidden. There's no difference whether it's a tiny drop or whether it's a gallon. I mean, unless you're going to say that since the tiny drop is forbidden, so a gallon is one drop times so much, so he's transgressing so many more times, whatever. But it's not like, well, this is where the prohibition actually begins or where the penalty begins. Nope. It's a capital offense for a Ben Noyach to transgress any one of the seven, and therefore, that's one way of looking at it. The other way is that measurements were given across the board, because if it's less than that amount, it's not called eating in this example. That's not really eating. Call it tasting, call it swallowing, but it's not really eating. In order to eat, there's a minimum required amount. And that has nothing to do with whether one is a Jew or a Ben Noyach. It has to do with whether you're a human being and you have a mouth and you have a throat and you swallow. So that's the determined amount. So that was the argument. So now they want to suggest that we apply that argument to the discussion here of Tam Ki'ikar. And he explains. 5 lines down. According to the Rambam, that shiurim, amounts, measurements, were not prescribed for Bnei Noyach. V'chayav akol shehu, and therefore the Ben Noyach is obligated for any amount. And if we're using the example of eating, for ben noyach, if he consumes aver min hachai, forbidden food for him, the smallest amount is the same as having a large amount. It's just as forbidden. Then, this is what the Chasam Sofer and Meloi HaRoim suggest. Tam ki ikar asur. Then we do say that tam ki ikar applies to a ben noyach, and it would be forbidden, even if it's not the food itself, it's not the item itself, but just like with regards to a Jew, because the prohibited food gave a taste to whatever it is, it's the same as the food. And then on the other hand, ula ha-toisves, and according to the Toisves commentary, the gam b'nei noyach einam chayovim al-pachis mikashiur, that b'nei noyach, as just like by the Jew, are not obligated if they had less than the required amount to transgress. If they had less than whatever the amount will be, let's for argument's sake just use our terms and let's say it's an ounce. So if the minimum amount that one would be prohibited to have would be, let's say, an ounce, so if a ben noyach had half an ounce, it's the same thing as a Jew having half an ounce of something that is forbidden for him to eat, that's non-kosher. So then in that case, yesh loymar, we can then say, dein tam ki'ikar libnei noyach, that the whole concept of tam ki'ikar does not apply to bnei noyach. V'chol zeh, and all of this, lemai dekai molan, according to what we have established, tam ki'ikar de'iraisa. That's a whole separate discussion in the Talmud, whether this concept of tam ki'ikar, that the taste that something gave is to be considered like the item itself, is that a biblical rule or is that a rabbinic rule that they introduced? So this whole approach that we took until now is according to what we accept, that the whole idea of tam ki'ikar is biblical. The Leman Damar Rabbanan, for according to the opinion that says that the whole concept of tam ki'ikar is rabbinic, vaday lo nemer livnei noyach, then certainly it does not apply to bnei noyach, even according to the Rambam. Ubedina shiurin ayin masher hashamti liil besif katan beis ubesif katan vav kasafti im nemru livnei noyach takonus ubzeres rabbanon. Then he says, and as far as the shiurim, as far as the measurements, which way do we go? Do we follow the Rambam that there are no measurements for the non-Jew and everything is forbidden, or do we follow Tosfos that the measurements do apply? He says, well, that look back at what I wrote in subsection 3, and in subsection 6, I discuss whether the rabbinic decrees and all of their rules, whether they apply to Bnei Noach as well. The Hagoyin shoylu meishi b'siman peivav b'madura chamisha heveisi teir of divrei kotcha liil b'sif katan gimel b'dermaskel v'sham kasav. Now another codifier, the genius, the author of the Shoylu Meishiv, and he tells us exactly where that's found there, and that he brought him down earlier as well. He wrote as follows: B'pshitus. He wrote very straightforward and very obvious. The tam ki'ikar leise beven noyach, that the whole concept of tam ki'ikar, that the taste is to be considered like the item itself, does not apply by bnei noyach. He says that just straight out. Umashma, and what seems to be implied, the soiver kain, that he holds so, aliba de kulei alma, according to everybody. Av v'asevim dechayev v'kol shehu, even according to those, namely the Rambam, that maintain that a non-Jew is chayev, is obligated, even if he eats the most minute amount, meaning that the shiurim don't apply. So he does not agree with the Chasam Sofer or the Meloi HaRoim, because he seems, the Shoylu Meishiv seems to hold that according to everybody, it has nothing to do with the shiurim, but according to everybody, tam ki'ikar does not apply to bnei noyach. Mikol Makoim, nonetheless, Gufa Isur Chamur Mitam Be'alma. In other words, it's two separate things according to him. The way he explains it, Maimonides, the Rambam, would hold that any amount is forbidden. Okay? Any amount, the taste of the most minute amount. But it's got to be a taste of the item itself. Meaning the item itself has to be eaten. But to take it to the next level and say that the taste without the actual substance, no. He says, why do you have to assume that Maimonides, that the Rambam would say that? No. Tam ki ikar does not apply, although there's no prescribed amount. So what's the minimum requirement? Any amount of the food itself. And actually, it makes sense. Logically, that seems so. For we see the betam ki ikar pligiba rav revasa because we in fact see that when it comes to this whole concept in the Jewish law of tam ki ikar, of the taste, that it's considered like the item itself, there's a big dispute between the great giants as to whether it's a biblical prohibition or a rabbinic prohibition. How could anybody argue? Isn't it obviously biblical? If you're telling me that it's the equivalence of the food itself, that's what it means, tam ki ikar, that the taste is just like the food itself. How can anybody say that it's only rabbinic? The fact that there could even be such a dispute shows you that it's a different category. Because when it comes to a Jew eating a minute, tiny amount, everybody agrees, although originally the Talmud, that itself is also a dispute. But as far as the conclusion in the ruling in Jewish law, everyone agrees that we follow the sage in the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan, that says that the kol shehu, the smallest amount of forbidden food, is actually biblically forbidden. And what we mean by measurements there is only as far as the punishment goes. The person would not get punished by the Jewish court for eating what he wasn't allowed to if he ate less than whatever the amount was. Let's say it's an ounce. But everyone agrees that eating less than an ounce is still forbidden. So there you have it. Everybody agrees with that part, and yet there's a dispute whether the taste, which is not the real substance, the tam, whether that's biblical or whether that's only rabbinically forbidden. Vayn b'mashe vesi b'kunteres ha'ares siman tzadik aleph ois zaym dim maskul v'ameh u'v'shalis v'tshuves hadar siman chafei ois hey v'dapim she'ein mesumonim hadapim v'hei machar daf tal. So he tells us, take a look at what I brought down in a different section over here, and what's brought down, and he gives us a reference to a book. He says that the pages are actually not numbered. It's a section over there where there's no pagation, so it's after page 39. But he can't even give us the page number because page numbers are not the page. Okay. So far, just to sum up this paragraph, we have two approaches. One approach is that the concept of tam ki ikar, that the taste, like that's absorbed in whatever, let's say the pot, is like the original item, that depends on whether we say that there are shi'urim, measurements, amounts, for the non-Jew as by the Jew or not. So if you say that there are measurements, and that means that if he eats less than the prescribed amount, he does not get punished, so then we would say that tam kikar. And if you take the other approach, that there are no shiurim, Sorry, what did I just say? I forgot. If you take the approach that there are shiurim and less than a shir, there's no punishment, then you would say there's no tam kikar. But if you say that there are, let's stay focused. Rambam says that by Bnei Noach there's no shiurim. Any amount is just as forbidden. According to that, we would say that for Bnei Noach we apply tam ki'ikar. Tosfos says that for Bnei Noach there are shiurim, and if they eat less than a certain amount, no punishment. According to that, we would not apply the rule of tam ki'ikar. And there's no such thing as, let's say, a non-kosher pot because it absorbed forbidden food for a non-Jew. That's one approach. The other approach is, it's irrelevant whether you say about shi'urim, about the measurements. No matter what, tam ki'ikar, the rule does apply to Bnei Noach. And then we had the other opinion that says that it doesn't apply at all, ever. Tam ki'ikar does not apply to Bnei Noach at all. Ubeinyan zeh. Next paragraph. Toma yedidi agoyin abezdin kilas valuchiski. Yishmeim trim v'chaskim bekunter v'soy sheveisi liyol b'marchas abei zoy stalut. Halagoyin chasam sefer. So, as far as this is concerned, he's quoting now a contemporary of his that is bewildered with what the Chasam Sofer that we quoted above, who said that it depends on whether shiurim apply to non-Jews to Bnei Noach or not. Ayin sham b'sif katan chai, v'ani ahed yoyter reisi lagoyin maram shik b'chelik irdeya siman kuf yutes. And I, the very simple person, I saw what's brought down by another one of the great codifiers, known as the Maharam Sheikh, Shekosav, who wrote, Sharav Shoyel, that the rabbi that's asking the question there, Heyir, al Mashekosav Agoin Chasam Sefer, Besiman Yutes, Hanal, is asking on that which the Chasam Sefer writes, the Beben Noach Tam Ki'ikar Deiraisa, that when it comes to a Ben Noach, Tam Ki'ikar applies on a biblical level. That it does apply biblically. And it's proper to copy, to write down, to quote his holy words. Vihu, shehiksha. And he asked, if you're going to say so, if you're going to say the approach that the Chasam Sefer seems to say, what happens if a piece of Eiver min achai, a piece of meat that nobody is allowed to eat, it's Eiver min achai, a little piece, fell into regular permissible meat. Upalat boy, and it expelled taste. It was a pot that was cooking, and a piece of Eiver min achai fell into this whole big thing. So it comes out that according to that, the Jew would be forbidden to even sell that mixture to a non-Jew. Not only can he not sell it to a Jew, because non-kosher Eiver min achai meat fell into this big pot of kosher meat, he wouldn't be allowed to sell it to a Ben Noach. I can't sell Eiver min achai to a Ben Noach. We've discussed this a number of times in previous classes. A Jew cannot sell non-kosher meat to another Jew. Can't. If it's not properly, ritually slaughtered and soaked and salted, etc., I can't sell it to a Jew. Likewise, I can't sell Eiver Min HaChai to a Ben Noyach, because he can't eat it. I can't sell it to him. So now, you have a pot of kosher meat, and a little bit of Eiver Min HaChai, which is not kosher, for anyone, fell into that pot. So now, according to that, the Jew would not be able to sell it even to a Ben Noyach. The kosher, but here's the question. Hatam einay asur ela mishum de marbinon mehatmeim le'asor tziron v'roitvan. The problem is, how do we know? How do we deduce in the oral law that a taste of something is forbidden? It's because we learn it out from inedibles, from non-kosher food, to forbid their juice, their liquid. Ulivnei noyach loy nemar atmeim ve'ein sir v'chelev asur. And when it comes to bnei noyach, that word is not used when the prohibition of Eiver Min HaChai applies. It's a word which is used in the Torah, in the verse, in the Bible, for the Jew. And for that we learn that a Jew can't even have the juice that oozes out of something which is forbidden. But for the Ben Noach it doesn't apply, and therefore Ben Noach is permitted to eat all parts of the fat of the animal, as long as it's not Eiver Min HaChai. V'shekasav b'pleisi, Siman Kuf Aleph, Ushor Achreinim, V'heishiv. So then he answers as follows. Hinei emes, yes, it's true. The Maran, referring to Chasam Sofer, Bier calls them, B'tshuvasi b'chelik yeridei Siman Kuf Yudalit. Yes, the Chasam Sofer indeed explained all of this in his responsa. V'hevi sham b'ktsara, ma shehaya kasha li ala Rambam, ba'asiri mimarcholas asuros. And he brought down over there briefly what I had difficult, my question, in the Rambam in Maimonides, in the 10th chapter of Maicholas Asuras, of forbidden foods. And what's that, namely? The behektesh mashkin hayetzim me'am asurim ve'in loikin mishum de'enon kemoisen min haTorah. We have an interesting ruling. When it comes to sanctified, sacred foods of, let's say, a sacrifice. Now, what about the liquid that oozes out of it? The sacrifice itself, I can't eat. Let's say it's a burnt offering, or let's say it's the portion that goes to the kohen, to the priest. So I can't eat it. Fine. What about the juice that oozes out of it? Not the actual meat. So, the ruling of the Rambam is that it's forbidden. However, there isn't any penalty. You don't get the lashes as you would if you ate the actual meat. Why? Because the juice is not like the actual substance of the meat on a biblical level. Implying that the only prohibition is rabbinic. V'nis kashesi. And my problem, my difficulty is, according to the words of the commentary of the Tosfos in the Tractate of Chulin, the chol yom nase giul lachaveiroi umitam debatel beroiv. V'hikshu the gam lacher shenase noisar lo yehi tzarich merika ushvira b'chli cheres. V'al korchin mishum de'ein mevatlin Israel lechatchila k'dekasav v'nekudas hakesef siman tzad gimel. V'i nema mashkin hayetzim mehem einon kemoison because what is b'chulin b'cheres tavav the chiyai gavna shesiya lav b'chlal achila elo l'chshayav l'maychol v'yikroish yehei asur. Okay, basically what we're talking about over here is if you have leftover meat of a sacrifice after the time limit of eating it, You're not allowed to leave over any amount of the meat. It has to be consumed. Different sacrifices have a different time frame. Once that time has passed, that meat now becomes unedible, becomes non-kosher. And it's called noisar, leftovers. Now, what happens with the utensils in which it was prepared, etc., if it's already noisar? So it has to be kashered as if it's non-kosher meat, even though it was originally properly slaughtered. It's part of a sacrifice. Everything was done good. But now it becomes not kosher from after the deadline. The time made this kosher piece of meat non-kosher, to the extent that if you cooked it, it's the same as cooking non-kosher meat. So then we have a rule that ein mevatlin isur lechatchila. You're not allowed to purposely cancel out something which is forbidden. I believe we discussed this. I don't recall exactly in which class it was. Basically, there's a concept of bittul, which we spoke all about, and that would mean usually it's the ratio is 1 to 60. So if the forbidden the minority of forbidden is no longer identifiable, it's not a piece of anything, and it dissolved or it got mixed into something, so then if you have 60 times against it, everything is fine, it's good to go. So can you do that in the first place? For whatever reason, the answer is absolutely no. Everybody agrees you can't do that. You can't take a big pot of kosher meat and then take just a little bit of non-kosher something and put it in and say, well, it's going to be more than 60 times of the kosher against it, so it'll be good. Can't do that. So, what about the liquid that's coming out of this? So they say that liquid is not considered included in the food only when it actually becomes congealed. At that point, it becomes food. Until that point, it's a separate entity with separate rules, even though it's the juice that's oozing out of this meat. It's okay. Im kain, bo'od shebalua adain bakli einoi asur klal min haTorah. So using that logic, as it applies to juice oozing out of a piece of meat, that it's not the same category of the meat, well then, let's apply to our discussion here, and the forbidden item, the Eiver min HaChai, that has been absorbed into the pot should not be biblically forbidden. So why does it need to be broken if it's an earthenware vessel that cannot be koshered? So the noisar that's in it, the leftover meat of the sacrifice, so the juice that oozes out and gets absorbed into the wall, why do you have to biblically break that vessel? It's only the juice that oozed out. It's not the actual meat. And the meat is the noisar, not the juice. And the juice never turned into food. V'chein kashe l'ma shekasav aran b'seif avodah zara da'af im blinas laila poigem afilu hachi boi shvira mishum dablia atzma bekli tzarich biur kashe gam ken kanal ha'ablia eino yosur klal ima mashkin ha'yotzim mehem einon kemoisan. Okay, then there's another thing he brings in, another question, that another one of the early commentators, the Ran, at the end of Tractate of Avodah Zarah, there's a concept that after a certain amount of time, the taste that became absorbed into the pot is considered foul. And therefore, when it comes out in the cooking, let's say, it won't be considered tam ki'ikar, and it won't be considered that it's making the food forbidden, because it now has a foul taste because it's been sitting inside the wall too long. So even though every time you cook it a little bit comes out, but it's already a foul taste. And how much time is that? So there's one opinion that says that if it stayed overnight, if the entire night passed, so when we're talking about noisar, if let's say the deadline to eat it was nightfall, you have to finish it by nightfall, and you didn't, and this cooked meat of the sacrifice with its juice was absorbed into the walls of the pot, and now comes the morning when you have to burn the noisar meat, which is a separate mitzvah. Why do we say that the pot, if it's made out of earthenware, has to be smashed? It's not kosher, and it absorbed the non-kosher. Why are we smashing the pot in order to do the mitzvah of getting rid of the noisar when it only absorbed the juice? The actual meat didn't go into the pot. It's the juice. It's the taste that was absorbed. If you're going to say that the juice is not like it. So he's asking from that point of view that we do see that in fact the juice of something would be considered like the thing itself. So that's the question. Now he's going to go on to explain. Ubier lon maransham. So the explanation that was given there, I believe he's referring to the Chasam Sofer, the Chenu b'Sefer Be'er Yaakov, and likewise the same explanation is given in another place called the Be'er Yaakov. The Vadai Mashka Yoytzi Alidei Bishul Hu Kimamish Hadavar Da'aser. He says, for sure, the liquid that comes out through cooking something is absolutely like the item itself, like the non-kosher. Ela d'cholzman shu machui, but as long as it is not in its regular form of being meat, ika lemeimar, we can say that it's not considered food. That in such a case we say that a beverage is not included in food until it congeals. And for that we need a pasuk, we need a verse, to include if someone drinks it that he's also transgressing biblically. Because otherwise, without that verse, I wouldn't realize that it's forbidden. So we're on the second column, left-hand side, third line. That I would have thought that eating something that is not in the normal full state, but rather it's crushed, I would think it's not included in eating. And for that reason, I need a special verse. And that teaches me that when something is expelled from, let's say, the wall of the pot, that is considered, that cooked something which came out through the heat, that is absolutely like the original thing itself. I wouldn't have thought so otherwise. And even before a person comes to actually eating it, and even if I wouldn't have a verse to teach me this, nonetheless, it would be forbidden. L'inyan, the shem noisar olav. at least I would know that it's considered nicer. That I would know that it's considered this prohibition of the food of the sacrifice, which is leftovers. And also you'd be forbidden to try to nullify it with adding more when you cook it so that it can be considered that it's nullified. Can't do that either. That's as far as nicer goes. However, mashke hayotzei rak derech schita al yedei melicha. How about a liquid that only comes out through squeezing it or salting? The salt extracts the liquid. Ze misvara eino kimamish. So that, logically, is not considered like the item itself. It's not the same. For that, I do in fact need a verse to teach me that that's also forbidden. As the Talmud in Chulin teaches us. Then I would indeed assume, if not for the verse, that that's not like the actual forbidden food itself. If not for the verse, Havamina, I would have thought, that it's only rabbinically forbidden if it came out through squeezing it or through salting it. And that's the type of liquids that the Rambam in the 10th chapter of Macholas Asuras that we mentioned is speaking about. Where he's speaking about the hekdesh, we said the sacrifice, and we said the liquid that comes out of them are forbidden, and that there's no penalty for it. This is the gist of the Chasam Sofer's explanation. The Yotzim is there. So what comes out, says the S'dei Chemed, from what comes out of this? L'nidon shelanu, in our case, the chaylev v'yitzir, that when we're talking about the fats or the juice that comes out of the meat, the lulei kra, that if not for the verse, hava mina, I would have said demuter, that it's absolutely permitted. Vein mashkina yotzim kemoisan, and therefore the liquid that comes out of the meat is not like the forbidden meat itself. Im kain, if that's the case, the ben noyach delays lukra. So when it comes to ben noyach, where I don't have this verse that teaches me not to think what I would normally think, by the ben noyach I don't have that verse. Einam kemoisan. Therefore, the liquid, in fact, is not like the original forbidden meat. V'shar lahem, and therefore it's absolutely permitted for them. They're allowed to have whatever the fats or the juice that oozes out. Aval mashke haroitev sheyetz al dei bishul. However, the liquid that comes out through cooking, not through salting or through squeezing, but through the actual cooking process with heat and water, do mitzat svara, that there I don't need a verse. There it's logic. And logically, kimamish. It's considered like the food itself. The juice that oozes out, or that comes out of a piece of meat through cooking, their logic tells me that it's the same as the meat. The asur, and therefore it would be forbidden. Ella, the salka daitin, the loy mikre kederech achila. The only reason why I would think that over there it's not forbidden is because maybe that's not the normal way to eat it. So we have another rule that if that's not how it's normally eaten, then it's not considered a prohibition. And since normally meat is eaten as meat, and the juice that oozed out of it through the cooking, that's not normally how it's eaten. It's just there with the meat, but you don't just drink it separately. So that would be a different story why it may not be forbidden. So So for that, you need a verse to teach you that it's still considered the same as eating, even though you're drinking it, that it's forbidden. So that I need the verse to teach me that even for a ben noyach, if he is eating it not in the normal way of eating, it's still forbidden. Because again, we're saying like the Rambam, that for the ben noyach, any amount is forbidden. Because there is no measurement, there's no amount for the bnei noyach. As the Rambam wrote in the Laws of Kings. So in any case where there's no amount and the slightest amount is forbidden, so then also if a person is eating it in a way which is not the normal way that the person would derive benefit from it, they're not swallowing it in a normal way, it's still forbidden if you say that the smallest amount is forbidden. If so, so then it does make sense what the Chaim Sefer writes. As far as the non-Jew, the Ben Noach is concerned, that we do say this concept of Tam Ki'ikar, that it's biblically forbidden for the Ben Noach to even have the taste which is expelled from it. Hainu bebishul, meaning through cooking. But when it comes to the juice that just oozes out of it, or the fats, or whatever, that would not be forbidden because we don't have a verse to forbid it. We have a verse for the Jew that it's forbidden. We don't have a special verse for the Ben Noach. So basically, what he wants to conclude is that, practically speaking, if you have a pot that Aver min hachai was cooked in it, and now that the walls of that pot absorbed the taste of Aver min hachai, the Ben Noach cannot, until you kosher the pot, cannot cook his regular non-Aver min hachai meat in that pot and eat it. However, he is allowed to benefit, to eat or drink or whatever, the stuff, the juice that oozes out of Aver min hachai. Even though he can't eat the meat, but the liquid that comes out of it would be permitted. Okay, we're going to do the next one, which is basically just a reference. It doesn't tell us, he just tells us where to look it up. And that is Yutes. In the middle of the left-hand column, it's just a couple of short lines. Le'inyan shoichad. As far as bribing, bribery is concerned. Im mitzuva ben noyach shlo likach shoichad. Is the ben noyach commanded not to take a bribe? And for that matter, if the Jew does give a bribe to the Ben Noach, is the Jew not only transgressing giving a bribe, which maybe is a problem? I mean, a Jew is not allowed to give a bribe to another Jew, and a Jew is not allowed to accept a bribe from a Jew. But how does that apply to the Ben Noach? So, if a Ben Noach is not allowed to accept a bribe, so if the Jew gives the bribe to the Ben Noach, he's causing him to transgress what we've discussed at length in previous classes, the concept of lifnei iver le'siten michshel, that you're not allowed to put a stumbling block in front of the blind person, and you can't cause someone else to transgress. So if a Ben Noach is not allowed to accept the bribe, then the Jew, by giving him the bribe, is causing him to sin. So, what's the rule there? Kasavti S'dei Chemed b'chelik haklolim b'mareches havav klal chavav sif katan lamed aleph ayin sham. So he tells us where in the S'dei Chemed he wrote about this and where to look it up and see what he wrote about bribe as far as bnei noach are concerned. So, is it permissible for a ben noach to bribe a judge in a certain case? Like, what would be the prohibition? Would it fall under a form of theft? And for that matter, what about lying? Is it forbidden for a ben noyach to lie, to say an outright lie, an untruth? Is that so? There's a concept called gnevas das. Gnevas das literally means stealing the person's mind frame or understanding, tricking a person, being deceitful in a way that you cause a person to think something which isn't true. That's called gnevas das. And a Jew is not allowed to do that, even to a non-Jew. It's not monetary theft, it's not stealing any property, but it's the idea of tricking. So in business, all too often, unfortunately, that's part of business where they give the wrong impression. They didn't outright say anything untrue, and therefore you have many lawyers and lawmakers or whatever that, primarily the lawyers, the attorneys, that make a lot of money for these great big corporations, that they're trying to, how can they be dishonest and make a lot of money within the letter of the law without breaking it? So you have all that fine print and all that, and then when they sell you something, or all those scams, which are all legal, not all, the ones that are, the scams that are legal, but if it's a scam, it means that they're giving the person the false impression, but they didn't lie. And therefore, legally, you can't win, if you try to sue them or whatever, in many cases. And of course, you have many lawyers that's their job, to teach or to control or to guide in being dishonest. It's very, very sad. So for a Jew, there's no question, he's not allowed to do any of that, not only to a fellow Jew, but even to a ben noyach. He's not stealing, he's not lying. Being deceitful is forbidden. Question is, what about ben noyach? It's called gnevas das. It's not really stealing, but it's a form. So here we're talking about bribing. It's definitely not moral, not morally correct. It's not a good thing. It's not a nice thing. So surely you don't want to do it. But we're asking, technically speaking, is it actually outright forbidden by the letter of the law? So until next time, wishing everybody much success in studying, in teaching, in promoting the 7 mitzvahs b'nei noyach, and most importantly, observing and making this world the perfect world that it's meant to be, with the complete revelation of our righteous Mashiach, as we are entering into that era already. We're at the advent of Mashiach, and may become totally revealed for all immediately now. Thank you.